learning the game here. So we're going to cover the basics of Arcade. I was telling Bill before we let everybody in, a few years ago, I did webinars and some presentations on attribute rules, a very specific use case for Arcade. And then later last year, I was like, hey, Bill, we should probably just cover Arcade in general. Let's not let the cart get before the horse here. So welcome. Yeah, we're gonna do a quick overview of what Arcade is. I'm assuming most of you here probably heard, seen, maybe used it already, but we'll do a quick overview and then kind of look at all the places you can use it in the Esri platform, and then kind of how to use it in general. The basic pieces you need to kind of get an expression executed. And then I'll do a little bit of demo, because honestly, the demo is where the concepts are going to make a lot of sense. Get to see them. I'll construct some expressions, and then we'll see kind of what the output is in a web map. And if there's enough time, I'll show you kind of what it looks like in Pro. But there will be more in part 2 of really like getting into the different things you can do and applying them in web maps and editing forms and ArcGIS Pro, maybe a little dashboard, configuration. So. And then we'll just talk about constructing, testing, and debugging, the process that I like to follow myself. Always test, and debugging. Honestly, in the last year or two, has come a long way. We can now write to a console and see outputs, test outputs. So cool stuff, and very, very useful and effective for designing things in the Esri platform. So. With that said, the overview of Arcade. These are just some quick bullet points, but one of my favorites that I'd like to start with is that it's very portable, as in it's already baked into the background of pretty much everything on the Esri platform. It's already in Pro. It's already in ArcGIS Enterprise in the portal realm. It's already in ArcGIS Online. Almost everything in ArcGIS Online. It's in the runtime SDKs. It's in the JavaScript API. You can use it with the Python API as a field calculation if you want. So it's everywhere. It's portable. It's very lightweight. There's no import libraries like the Python. It is what it is. You get kind of whatever version of Arcade that depends on where you're using it. The version, like your version of Pro that you're in, is going to have a corresponding version or access to versions of Arcade. The level of ArcGIS Enterprise you have gives portal access to a certain number of the builds of Arcade. So keep that in mind. If you're in the ArcGIS realm, you're almost always going to have the latest and greatest every piece of Arcade. So and it's secure. That's another big one, constantly comparing it to Python, just because that's the other very common scripting expression, whatever language that's used in the Esri platform. But it doesn't have access to anything outside of the Esri application that you're using it in. So like if you're running it in Pro, it's not like going into your operating system to look at directories and that kind of thing. So it's very secure in the sense of it's not doing things like on your own system. You can use it to reference some websites and stuff, but it's more in the sense of like constructing a URL and having someone click it, right? So it has the look and feel of JavaScript. That's why I like it, because I know JavaScript and I knew JavaScript ahead of time. So if you also know JavaScript and you haven't used Arcade, you're going to feel comfortable in the sense of how it's constructed. And when you look at the docs and the reference documentation and examples and things, they're going to make sense, right? So to that point, many of the base JavaScript functions are available. Also Excel functions. They've kind of baked in some of those because as users and managers of GIS, we know that a lot of times we're just looking at the tabular data that's associated to our GIS data and doing things, sometimes we just take it to Excel and do things over there because it's easier or faster or more comfortable. So keep in mind that, if you're doing things in Excel, maybe you could translate that into an Arcade expression, field calculation, some sort of, something like that. So, and then the construction or the background of Arcade really depends on two big things, which are the profiles as to where you can use them and the function bundles that are associated with those profiles. So that we're going to jump to next. We'll look at the documentation page and explain more of what the profile and the function bundles are, which really should be referenced ahead of time before you start trying to build something, because like myself, there's nothing more frustrating than getting into writing the arcade expression and then you go to use it somewhere like labeling or symbolization, and you realize, oh, the main function I'm using does not work here, right? So we'll start there and look at the background, and then I always like to mention it is not replacing Python. It, in the sense of what you do with Python now, you may or may not be able to duplicate with Arcade. It may be very slow to do in Arcade, the things you do in Python, right? Especially if you're doing geometry, scripting, or functionality, or whatever. If you have a field calculation in ArcGIS Pro that you're doing with Python, or something, it is not a replacement. So just keep that in mind. They can be used in conjunction. But Python will always be here. Python will always be the bigger workhorse for some of this stuff like geometry. So, all right. So where can you use it? This will make more sense as we go into the profiles and the functionality, the function bundles. But in general, like I said, you can use it pretty much anywhere. And so on the left side, I have the big players: ArcGIS Online, ArcGIS Enterprise, the runtime SDKs, the API for JavaScript. And I don't have it on here that you can use it with the API for Python, but you can somehow, some way bake it in there. But I don't, I'm not going to dive deep into that one. So the places you can use that in these larger items: symbology, labels, pop-ups, dashboards, forms, editing forms, attribute rules. So these are like our profiles on the right side here. And so now, if I share my screen, my other screen here, if I leave this behind. So here at the arcade reference, sorry guys. So we'll go to the home page, right? So developers.arcgis.com/arcade. If you want to really get into the deep dive, more than what I'm going to cover today, here's your introduction. Here's kind of what I'm showing you here today: where to use it, why is it useful, and then release notes, supported products, all that stuff. The version matrix, this is something always worth looking into, depending on Pro, Enterprise, Portal, the ArcGIS Online. You're going to have different versions of Arcade. So we'll cover that when we look at some examples of some functions. But so the profiles, this is where I always want to caution people before you start writing an arcade expression. When you know where and how you want to do something with arcade, let's say a web map, let's say you want to really beef up or do something cool with your pop-up, please go to the profile and find the profile for pop-ups and click that, and you're going to have a few more options. But if you are just adding something into your pop-up, you've got profile variables and function bundles. So these two kind of come together. The profile is where you're going to use it. The function bundles are associated to those profiles. So you can see here that if you're going to do something in the pop-up, you have access to these function bundles. To that, the opposite of this, if we go back to something like symbology, let's see, what is that, visualization? Let's say visualization in ArcGIS Online. That's not fun. Well, you would have access to function bundles of core and geometry. So something that's missing from here, that's not in the core bundle or the geometry bundle, is things like feature sets, where you're accessing data from another layer or table or something. So a lot of times I'm like, hey, let's go do some cool visualization symbology and use a related table or some other layer that it's intersecting, and then it's like, oh yeah, you can't do that. So before you get to that point where you go to apply it and it's like, yeah, that doesn't work, always reference your profiles and look at your function bundles. Make sure you can do what you want to do before you spend time writing the expression. So yeah, so it's, function reference here. This is where once you start writing your expressions and testing, this is where a lot of time is probably going to be spent. And if you're already using Arcade, then I'm saying this. I can't keep all this in my head, right? But I can bookmark this, and I'm constantly going to this page to look up some things like date difference or ISO month, or things like popping and pushing and different things that I'm doing with arrays and dictionaries. And you don't have to keep all this in your head and know how to do this on the fly. But I want everyone to know that right here in this page, you can find what you need. If you want to do a feature set by name and you want to remember what are the parameters I need to put in here, click here. The parameters are right here. The documentation for Arcade is really good. Almost everything is going to have an example right there on the docs page. So copy and paste this in, start testing, change your variables to whatever you're doing, and start, constructing, testing, and debugging, right? So, all right, with that said, I will jump back over here and we'll talk about, so we talked about the how, the profiles, the function libraries, and the bundles, see where to get those. Now we get into the expressions, right? So the expression is what I just showed you, is going to be constructed of parameters. And the thing to always keep in mind is the global variables that come with Arcade. So things like we just saw, like $feature, $map, $data store, things that you're going to commonly use in most, if not all, of your Arcade expressions. Those are variables that are available in Arcade. They mean something in Arcade, right? They have their own, Arcade says, yeah, when I see $map, I know what to do. The converse of that is the ability to create user variables. So when we get into writing some of these at the end here, it's always nice to be able to create our own variables, right? If you have experience with JavaScript or Python or experience with Arcade already, you know why that's important. It's good to be able to assign a variable somewhere along the expression and be able to test and overwrite and change. It's fantastic. It helps keep our minds clear, and especially when we're going back to look at code or expressions that we've written, like myself years ago. I'm like, oh, that's good. I'm glad I sent that to a variable because I can quickly change it here now. And then the other cool thing is that there's some baked in logic. There's some default logic that Arcade has, but you can also create your own. You can also create your own functions. So really powerful stuff. It can do a lot. And if you find something that it can't do, I mean, let's just give it time, because this Arcade expression language is it's constantly evolving and growing. I mean, since I started doing this in January, new things have come out. I'm like, oh man, I got to go look that up and see how that works. So yeah, so functions and logic, really cool stuff that you can do. And then ultimately, the thing that we're really interested in is the output, right? So know that you have various types of outputs that you get. Those are all based on the profiles and where you're using it. When you click that profile page for pop-ups or whatever, field calculations, it tells you one or more output types that can be used or referenced in that profile. So yeah, so now I've got about 10 minutes to do some demos. So what I'm going to do is open a web map that we have set up. I've set up for use with this webinar and presentations I've done throughout the year. This is in ArcGIS Online. So as we go through this, if you're using Portal, keep in mind that some of these functionalities, depending on your version of ArcGIS Enterprise, are not going to be available to you. That version matrix that you can get on the docs page will help you kind of figure out what's available for you. So it's frustrating sometimes, but we're always going to use ArcGIS Online for these demos because honestly, it's where the new great stuff and the cool stuff is. So if you're at Enterprise 10.9.1 or 11.1, you're going to have almost all of the stuff that I'm showing today. So if you're before that, it's going to be a little dicey. But anyway, all right. So some demos. We'll start with the basics. You can use this. We've got the properties for my trees layer. I've got a map. I've got some parcel polygons that are underneath my trees. I'm mapping trees. I'm doing inventory. I'm doing maintenance. I'm doing inspections. Right. This is a specific yet also general enough example that works with points on a map, inventory, inspections, whatever. So I have my trees, and the first thing I want to do is very basic. My label, I would like to have the species and the genus and species along with my common name, right? So this is going to, if we look at my data, this is going to involve 2 or 3 different fields that I want to convert into one single label item. So if I go in here and I say I want to change my labels, I have a label called asset name here that's just using the common name field, right? Common stuff, nothing too fancy there. But if I add a new label class and I say, let's turn this off. So if I go in here and I say, all right, I want to call this, let's say common name and genus species. I'm going to say, all right, here's my expression icon. So look for this as you're in the web maps, as you're in dashboards. There's a couple different places this is going to show up, but this is where it's like, all right, you can choose a field if you want. Like I have common name, I have genus, and I have scientific, but I can also click here and say, you know what, I'm going to take this into my own hands. I'm going to create my own expression. So always give your expression a name. We're going to say, let's just call it name, genus, and species for this demo. And so right here, we're seeing one of the big globals, one of the most common globals you're going to get, $feature. And then either the brackets and quotes of the field name, or you can do synonymously, you can do $feature dot asset name. And with the editors, it's got like IntelliSense kind of stuff. So it's kind of helping you kind of figure out, all right, you're typing $feature. Let me go ahead and give you a quick pop-up of all the attributes on this feature. So those two things are the same. Doesn't matter which one you use, but we're going to say, all right, so I've got the asset name. So actually, I want to use what I was talking about and create a variable. So I'm going to say var and say tree, let's say common name equals, and then that's where I want to use the common name attribute of every feature first. And so we're going to say common name, and then I'm going to say, you know what, there's another one. I want the genus equals, and then $feature. So we're accessing the specific feature itself, and we're saying genus, okay, and then var species equals, and then $feature dot species, scientific in this case. So now I've got my 3 fields that I want to concatenate. And so I can say, all right, return. Now I'm saying return me something. I want to join common name, and then a plus sign. This is one way to concatenate text, plus genus, plus species. And then I can say, well, let me run this and test it, right? Let's see what I get. Well, I'm getting peach, and then prunus, and persica. So that's great. But now I realize I need to have a space in there. So I can just add a space and then another plus sign. And then I'm realizing, okay, that should be good. Now if I run it, now it's saying prunus and prunus persica. And it's like, oh, well, the scientific field, I didn't realize that. I can actually just comment this out. I don't need genus because scientific actually has the genus and species. And so now I can change this. So sometimes as you go in and use your data, you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to go ahead and change that. So now if I get rid of this and I say, just give me the common name and the species or what. So now we're seeing peach and then Prunus persica. So one thing that's really cool with Arcade is like, hey, that's great. I would love for these to be on separate lines. Well, there's a really cool function that you can use. Instead of a space, we can use a built-in Arcade that's called text formatting .new line. And now when this runs, I'm going to get peach on one line and Prunus persica on the next line. So if I click done, now you can see that my labels, if I delete this, my label is the species or the common name and the another field called my genus and species. So that's real quick. You get to do that in there and label, and that's a very simple way of doing Arcade. So another one where you can use it, while I've got 2 more minutes, time just really flies with this stuff, but you can add an expression to your pop-up. So let's say I want to have a pop-up that is just, tree. I want in my pop-up, I want to see a field that is the tree plus the ID. So if I click on one of these parcels, I'm getting, I want to know maybe peach, the same type of thing, right? Maybe we want to do the peach and the common name and the scientific in the same realm here, but I want it to be in the pop-up. So I can go in here and I can say attribute expressions. I can add an expression, and you can write the same thing that was, and we'll do these without variables to show you the different ways you can do it. Got common name plus text formatting .new line plus, remember that was $ feature scientific, and we'll say common name and scientific, and then we'll test it, always test, and then done. And now if I go back to my pop-up, in my field, I can say select fields, and I can say I want to add that new expression into my pop-up, and I want that to be at the very top. And now we see peach and Prunus persica right there. It's a custom made expression. You could do this with anything. You could find the number of intersecting trees on a parcel. You could do all kinds of stuff if you go back and look at that. But in part 2, we will really get into the depths of really cool ways to use this stuff. But those are 2 very basic ways to do it. You can label, you can add things to your pop-ups. You can add custom HTML tables in here using Arcade now. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that we'll cover as we get into part 2. So with that said, a couple of things with this constructing and testing and debugging. Always, always, always save your expressions externally. You can save them as a text file. I like to save mine as JavaScript files because it looks like JavaScript and it was built kind of referencing JavaScript. If you're using an editor to write and construct and save your code, something like Visual Studio Code, when you save it as a JavaScript file, even though it's Arcade, you get all the nice formatting and colors and stuff. So, but I can't tell you how many times I've tried to throw something together real quick in the web map, and for some reason it fails or whatever, and then it closes my editor in the web app or the web map, and then that whole expression I wrote is gone. So if it's simple like that, 2 features combined, that's fine. But as you start to get more in depth, please remind yourself, oh, I should copy and paste this into a text file outside of this editor in the web map or in the dashboard or Pro or whatever. Save it somewhere so you can always go back and get it if something somehow it disappears. The editor, as we saw, has IntelliSense. When you put in $feature, it's going to give you access to a list of the fields. There's the editor has a list of the function references right there in the editor. So The editor can really help you. You can click that run button. You can use a console. There's a console function to write things to, like, in the background if you want to check, as your script or your expression is executing, what's going on. Chain your functions together. We're going to cover that more in depth in part 2, but combining things together will help Arcade run more efficiently. And when you're using a feature set, which is where you're getting the entire attribute table of something, only use the fields that you need. So we're going to focus more on this slide is more for part 2, but if you're going to do some testing and playing around in between, if you're coming back for part 2, keep in mind these things. So there's plenty of Arcade references on blogs. If you go to Esri or Google or whatever, you type in Esri Arcade or ArcGIS Online Arcade, you're going to get a ton of stuff. So, all right, I got to cut myself off.